Hey, thanks everybody. We got the room packed. That's awesome. I love to see it. You're all part of what we in the mycology community call the shroom boom. There's been a huge uptick in interest of all things mushroom in the last several years. So that's pretty fun for people like me who have been into mushrooms for 15 years and kind of just was in the woods by myself for a while. So this is great. Thanks everybody for being here. And thanks to Missouri River Relief for having me tonight to be part of the Big Muddy Speaker Series. I'm honored. So thank you. Guys, keep up the good work. Cleaning up those rivers, that's important. Also, thanks for the intro, mushroom celebrity. I might be the only one around, right? I don't know. From mushroom nerd to mushroom guy. Okay, WildWisde Botanicals is the name of my wife and I's business. We started this a few years ago. We do a lot of gardening, growing herbs, tea herbs, and medicinal herbs. And of course, we grow some mushrooms. And we also like to forage a lot. So we find a lot of wild medicinal plants and also mushrooms. And so we were turning these into products that we were really putting a lot of ourselves into and doing a good job with them, selling them to friends and acquaintances, things like that. Nothing major. But a little bit after I started to interact with the Missouri Mycological Society, I realized that there was just a really big hunger for knowledge about mushrooms. And I simultaneously realized that there weren't very many people that know very much about mushrooms. So I took it upon myself to come and teach as many people about mushrooms as I can. So the focus of our business has definitely shifted over the last couple of years to offering more things that are educational, like workshops, learn how to grow your own mushrooms, how to make medicinal mushroom tinctures, and things like I'm doing today, speaking to crowds both large and small about mostly foraging mushrooms, but pretty much anything mushroom related I like to talk about. You'll definitely notice by the end of the night. This is a pretty dense presentation. I like to take advantage of my time in front of you and try to get as much information out to you as possible. And I know that some of you are likely beginners to the world of mushrooms, and I know that some of you are not beginners. So hopefully there's a lot of information here that will be valuable to a high percentage of people in attendance. If you only get 10% of what I say, then you'll have to come back and learn another 10% in the future, right? All right. Job security. A quick disclaimer, you are in charge of your own safety, so I cannot be held responsible if you eat a poisonous mushroom. I'm going to do my best to make sure that does not happen to you. But if you do that, don't blame me, be smart. Have to put that with a friendly face, right? So this is Mushrooms of the Big Rivers. This talk is somewhat similar to a talk that I give a lot, but I modified it a little bit to focus a little more on the mushrooms that live in big river habitats along those rivers. Not in the middle of the river, obviously, but very close to them, right? Kind of where us people stick when we're hanging out by the river. So what I do first is start with a little bit of basic mushroom info, because I find that 75% at least of every crowd I speak to knows very, very little about mushrooms and how they work in environments and ecosystems. So I like to start with that kind of thing. So bear with me if that is not what you're here to learn. Then I will move into some of the toxic mushrooms that exist in our region. I think it's important to learn the most dangerous ones if you're interested in foraging mushrooms and you know the worst ones, the ones to avoid, then I think that puts you off to a good start. And then finally, I'll go into a few particular species that are highly prized edibles that grow right here in our region, and especially many of them are quite abundant along large rivers. So I hope you all enjoy the presentation. So fungi are ecological workhorses. They are literally the foundation of every single ecosystem on the planet. And the reason for that is that they're constantly busy recycling resources and facilitating life. So these two things may seem like opposites at first, but they're actually just both very important parts of pretty much every cycle that keeps life going on the planet. So fungi, I like to call them world builders. They're responsible for 90% of decomposition on our planet. If there were no fungi, there literally would be no soil, because soil is a mixture of ground up rocks, minerals mixed with organic material, right? Dead organic material. And after that organic material is dead, it has to be broken down into smaller pieces to fit in the soil. And that is the great job of fungi. So very, very important. You may have heard a talk by Paul Stamets, who says, if there were no fungi, we would all be buried in a giant pile of organic debris. But I take that a step further, where the giant pile of organic debris would never exist in the first place without fungi, because those plants could never have completed their life cycles without soil to grow in. So not much of a danger of that, if that were to happen. So most plants form what is known as a symbiotic relationship with fungi. And without this relationship that they form with most plants on the planet, those plants would not thrive, and most of them would not survive without some sort of intervention. It's a good time to mention that all of the photographs that you'll see in this talk are my photography of mushrooms that I found and took pictures of. And I try to put the scientific binomial of all those mushrooms up in the corner. So what is mycelium? How many people in the room are familiar with the concept of mycelium versus mushroom? Oh, that's so many hands. When I first started doing talks 4 or 5 years ago, it was 90% hands down almost every time. But I think that maybe some of this crowd is a little more in tune to the workings of nature than many. So that's great to hear. So mycelium is the term that we use for the vegetative body of a fungus. So it's actually the main body of a fungus. We call it mycelium. It's made up of these tiny microscopic strands called hyphae. And those hyphae spread through a substrate, which is another word for a food source. So an old log or a pile of leaves on the ground or a stick on the floor of the forest, those kinds of things. And as they spread through this food source, they gain nutrition, which they turn into energy. And they use that energy, when the time is right, to create fruiting bodies, or what we know of as mushrooms. So the mycelium produces mushrooms, which then produce spores to spread to new locations. What you're seeing in the photo here, you can see it says Trametes versicolor at the top. This is a turkey tail mushroom. Most of you are probably familiar with that one. And you're looking at the underside of a fruit body. And this is a piece of bark that I peeled off of a tree, and you're seeing the underside of the bark, a dead tree. And down here, you can see all this white, wispy, cottony material, and that is mycelium. So that is the body of that fungus. And when it gets enough nutrition from breaking down the underneath the bark, it puts that energy into making fruit bodies or mushrooms. So you can clearly see in that photo how the mushroom is coming out of the mycelium. So the wood wide web, this is kind of a cool term that you'll hear sometimes. Mycelial networks are somewhat like the internet of the forest, and they're thought to connect organisms in the woods and transfer things between organisms, such as nutrients, water, and even information. There have been some interesting studies showing that trees in forest ecosystems actually communicate through this mycelial network. And they have even deciphered a language of electrical impulses sent by these plants through the mycelial network. And I guess the language of most trees is about 40 words, just so you know. This is a really interesting topic. A huge amount of study is still needed. And a word of warning, this aspect of fungi is often kind of amplified or glorified into maybe a little bit more than it actually is. So symbiotic relationships are very complicated. So keep that in mind. If you want to learn more about the Wood Wide Web, I highly recommend the book Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. It's a very, very wonderful breakdown of mycelial networks. So there are a few basic mushroom lifestyles. This is a very simple slide. It's much more complicated than this, actually, but I'd like to give people a little bit of a basis on how to just understand fungi in a very general manner. So first, we have saprobic mushrooms, and those are the ones that I talked about that break down all the dead organic matter. So they do that by, and when I say they, I'm talking about the mycelium of the fungus, not the mushroom that you see, right? So the mycelium of these saprobic fungi spread through a substrate and they excrete enzymes. And these enzymes break down the substrate, cellulose or lignin usually, and they break that stuff back into its base components, so minerals and other components, and it makes them available for plants. So saprobic mushrooms usually grow from wood. Not always. There are saprobic ones that do not look like they're growing from wood, but generally, if you're hiking through the woods or along the river and you see a bunch of mushrooms growing on a fallen over log, tree, whatever, a stump, they're probably saprobic fungi. So when you see them, think, hey, those mushrooms are breaking that stump down and turning it into soil for all the other plants. So another thing to mention about saprobic mushrooms is they're generally the mushrooms that are cultivated. So when you're buying mushrooms at the farmer's market or in the grocery store, pretty much all of those mushrooms are saprobic mushrooms, especially if they are commercially grown mushrooms. So parasitic fungi is the second one on the list. This is a really complicated fungal lifestyle, but basically I think we all kind of understand what a parasite is. They infect living organisms. Usually plants is what we're talking about with fungi, but they infect all kinds of other things too, even humans, right? And they use these living organisms for their nourishment. Now, sometimes they will eventually kill their host, but many parasitic fungi do this very, very slowly, and the tree will often die from other causes than the parasite. Some of them are the opposite, and they kill them fast. Now, the third one is that mycorrhizal fungus mushroom that I was talking about. These are the ones that form those symbiotic relationships with plants. And when we're talking about fungi that produce mushrooms, fruit bodies, generally those mycorrhizal mushrooms are mycorrhizal or symbiotic with trees. We're talking about trees. And again, they share nutrients, energy, and information through this network. Mycorrhizal mushrooms can usually be spotted in the woods growing directly from the ground. There are some saprobic fungi that grow directly from the ground, but generally if you see a toadstool or an umbrella-shaped mushroom growing right from the ground, it's often a mycorrhizal mushroom. Mycorrhizal mushrooms, they usually grow near trees because they're linking up with the roots of those big plants, and they cannot be readily cultivated. So some examples of mycorrhizal mushrooms that you may know of would be morels, truffles, chanterelles, porcini. All of those mushrooms are mycorrhizal. And if you know anything about buying mushrooms, you know that those are all pretty expensive when you buy them. And the reason for that is that we really can't grow them very well, if at all, for most of them. So the ones that you're buying and eating are they're grown in the woods by the forest, wild harvested. So again, mushrooms arise from this mycelial network, and a mushroom is a temporary reproductive structure of these organisms that are unseen by us for most of its life. We don't see that mycelium very often. It's under the ground or under the bark of a dead tree or a stump. So it's usually inside the substrate, and we don't know it's there until it decides to make its fruit bodies. And the purpose of a mushroom is simply to spread the genetic material of a fungus to a new location. And they do this by spore dispersal. And so fungi produce spores that are emitted into the atmosphere, and they land in another spot, and they germinate, grow into mycelium, and then grow a new mushroom eventually. So that's how fungi are able to move from one place to another. They can't walk around like the same way that plants can't walk around, right? So plants make seeds, and there are all kinds of ways that plants disperse their seeds into the environment. Fungi make spores, and there are all kinds of ways they are dispersed into the environment. And the reason that there are so many different types of mushrooms, all these weird looking mushrooms that are all different, look at all the different ones just on that table there, is because they all represent a different strategy to get those spores into the environment. So form follows function. That has resulted in a whole bunch of different kinds of mushrooms, right? If you've ever paid attention to all the mushrooms you see on a hike in the woods, there's a lot of them, right? That's why there are so many different shapes and types, all different strategies to get those spores out. So here's a few more just kind of tidbits about fungi. Respect, not fear, is what I like to tell people. So there are approximately 12,000 fungal species that create mushrooms in North America. That is probably a vast understatement. There are probably many more species than that. Out of those 12,000 or 15,000 or whatever it is, it's estimated that only 1 to 2% of those mushrooms are toxic in any way. So only 1 to 2% of fungi are poisonous. Is anybody surprised that that number is so low? Most people are. We're kind of taught that mushrooms are pretty dangerous. You got to watch out for those things. You know, they're kind of lurking in the forest, ready to get you if you don't pay attention. So that's simply not true. 1 to 2% are toxic. Now, the toxic ones are very dangerous. So that makes, I'm not trying to make light of the poisonous mushrooms, but I think it's important for people to not be so scared of mushrooms and be more respectful of them. So it's okay to touch any mushroom, even the very most poisonous ones. To be poisoned by a mushroom, you must ingest it and you must digest the flesh of the mushroom, because the toxins that are contained in fungi affect the organs of your body. So your body must take them in and flush them through your system before they can cause damage to you. So in my hand in this photo is the Amanita bisporigera, or the destroying angel. How many people have ever heard of that mushroom before? Good, lots of hands. One of the very most deadly mushrooms on the planet, and it's in my hand there. So it's okay to handle poisonous mushrooms. Just don't eat a mushroom if you don't know what it is, right? In fact, I recommend handling mushrooms because it's a good way to learn their finer features and become familiar with them and better at identifying them. So also mushroom picking does not injure the mycelium, so the vegetative body of itself. It generally does not injure that. So it's more like picking the fruit from a tree when you harvest a mushroom. If you have an apple tree in your yard and it makes 300 apples one year and you pick all 300 apples, the next year the apple tree will still make 300 apples, or maybe even more, maybe less if there isn't any rain or if the squirrels go nuts or whatever, right? But it's okay to pick all those apples, and it's kind of the same way with mushrooms. Now, if you have an apple tree and you want the apple tree to make more trees, then if you picked all the apples, then you wouldn't really get any more apple trees, would you? Unless you planted them on purpose. So when you're harvesting mushrooms, be conscious of that and think, if I take all of the fruit bodies every time, then I'm reducing the number of spores that go into the environment and therefore reducing future harvests, right? So we don't want to do that. The most important thing is to protect the environment of a fungus. So I will touch on that again later. Almost done with this introductory part. Identifying mushrooms is difficult. I put this slide in here because I know that being a beginner to mushrooms and trying to learn how to identify them can be frustrating. It can be difficult. It's a daunting task for a lot of folks. So here's a couple of things to kind of enlighten that subject. Always check the ID of a new to you mushroom with multiple sources. This is a big one because people who just start out maybe don't realize how many different kinds of mushrooms there are and how similar some of them can look. And it's very easy to come to a conclusion that you think you identified the mushroom when maybe you didn't actually do that. So be sure to check multiple sources, online resources, knowledgeable people in the community. Books are great. So you want to find and identify a mushroom several times before eating it. It's important if you're not with someone who already harvests that mushroom a lot and eats it, then it's very important to be 100% certain of the identity of the mushroom you're going to eat. And harvesting it a few times before eating is a great way to do that. Years of work and dedication are required to reliably discern between many species. That's why I have this mushroom in the photo here. This is a species of Sterium, and this one has a common name of the false turkey tail. And this mushroom greatly resembles many other mushrooms, including the turkey tail mushroom. But not only that, it also greatly resembles lots of other mushrooms in this same genus that we would also call false turkey tail. So that is not something that you're going to pick up on quickly, honestly. So this is an example of how it takes a really long time to figure these things out. There are many similar looking fungi, so that experience helps you learn which details must be noted to lead one to a proper ID. So even kind of knowing what to look for is a skill that has to be developed. You guys are like, I'm never touching a mushroom again. This guy's really scaring me away. Don't worry, I'm going to help you. So here in Missouri, we have about 4,000 species of mushrooms. That's a lot. That's a lot of species for any kind of organism. Compare that to about 100 species of trees in Missouri. So all the different kinds of trees you can think of here in Missouri, there's about 100 of them. And there are about 1,000 species of birds in North America. So 4,000 mushrooms here in Missouri, 1,000 species of birds in all of North America. So finally, resist the urge to make it fit. This is one of the biggest things about mushroom enthusiasts who get really excited, especially in the beginning, and they find a mushroom and they look at all the pictures and they think that has to be it. But beware not to do that, because you will often be wrong. Prepare to be wrong. I have been into mushrooms for 15 years. I'm pretty seriously for 10 years, and I'm regularly wrong. So keep that in mind. Mushroom ID resources. So if you want to dive further into how to identify all these mushrooms that you're finding, I recommend going on a foray. A foray is simply a guided mushroom hike with someone who's a little bit knowledgeable and can kind of show you the ropes a little bit, right? And on a foray, you encounter the mushrooms in person. You can pick them up and hold them, and someone tells you what features to look for to identify them. So it really is just the best way to learn how to identify mushrooms. And that brings me to the Missouri Mycological Society. So MOMS, as we affectionately call the society, offers forays throughout the mushroom season almost every weekend. So I highly recommend that you check out the Missouri Mycological Society website, momyco.org. Go to the calendar of events and you can come and join us on a foray. Forays are free, so you got to go sign up on the website though. Facebook groups can be great. One thing about Facebook groups though, and I recommend joining a regional Facebook group, maybe Missouri focused or something like that. So you're not trying to wade through all the Rocky Mountain mushrooms and the West Coast mushrooms. Facebook groups are great. The Mycological Society has an excellent Facebook group. Be careful to kind of hang out in those groups a little bit and find out who the trusted members are. Usually they'll have a little group expert tag these days, but not always. There are a lot of guessers in these groups, so beware the guessers. It's good to learn who the trusted people are. So regional field guides is a big one. A lot of people try to get all their information online, but if you try to get all of your mushroom information online, there is just such a vast amount of misinformation and misleading things and just downright incorrectness about mushrooms. So I highly recommend getting a regional field guide, one that is focused on the region that you live in, so Missouri, and there are a few of them that are great. I'll show you at the end of the talk. Avoid those mushroom ID apps. I know everybody's excited about the mushroom ID apps. They're great for plants. They're pretty good at plants, but they just haven't quite figured mushrooms out yet. And it can be dangerous to rely on these apps to eat a wild mushroom, right? You don't want to take a picture and the robot tells you it's this mushroom, and then you look the mushroom up and it says you can eat it, and then you eat it. That is not a good path to learning how to identify or forage for mushrooms. So be careful of those apps. There have been many stories in the last few years of people eating very poisonous mushrooms because their app told them it was an edible mushroom. So be forewarned of those. Also, unproven YouTubers. Man, there's a lot of nonsense on YouTube. So be careful on there. Okay, so I'm going to move into, there's going to be a time at the end for questions, I think, but does anyone have any questions so far? I'd be glad to answer them. Okay, no questions. Feel free to raise your hand in the middle too if you need clarification on anything. All right, so common toxic mushrooms of Missouri. There are old mushroom hunters and there are bold mushroom hunters, but there are no old, bold mushroom hunters. So it's a risky endeavor to eat wild mushrooms, especially when you are uninitiated or highly knowledgeable. So be very careful. Don't be bold. Again, this is the destroying angel Amanita bisporigera in my hand there. One of the most toxic mushrooms on the planet. And coincidentally, very, very common here in Missouri, including along the big rivers, especially if you get up on the slopes a little bit into the timber. So here's that mushroom again, Amanita bisporigera. There is a huge variety of amanitas in Missouri's hardwood forests. We have a lot of hardwood forests here in our state. This genus, Amanita, contains a few of the deadliest species in the world, including this one. And this is our most commonly encountered species that is deadly poisonous, Amanita bisporigera, the destroying angel. Like many amanitas, it is a mycorrhizal mushroom, and it likes to live with oak trees. So that makes it a very common mushroom in this region, right? Has anybody ever seen an oak tree? Okay, just kidding. So we have a lot of these really poisonous mushrooms right here in our local woods. That might sound kind of scary, but if you learn what it is, there's no reason to be scared, right? And you can teach others what it is so they won't eat it mistakenly as well. This one does cause some mushroom poisonings, maybe not every year, but it's not super infrequent. Don't eat this mushroom. It can cause organ failure and even death if eaten. I have seen reports that estimate your chance of survival after eating a full serving of an Amanita bisporigera is about 50% survival rate. So that's very, very low. Not good chances. A flip of the coin. So this photo is a close-up of an Amanita stem, an Amanita bisporigera stem, emerging from this structure at the base of the ground. And we call this a vulva. And what you're seeing there, that kind of sac-like structure at the base of that mushroom stem, is the remnants of an egg structure called a universal veil that these Amanita mushrooms grow out of. They're these little eggs that are just under the surface of the ground. And when the temperature and humidity in the environment is correct, the eggs hatch. And that beautiful white mushroom, the destroying angel, grows out of the egg. And it leaves behind the eggshell at the base of its stem. So this is a very defining feature of this species. And if you find a mushroom that has that thing at the base of the stem, certainly don't eat that one, right? There are a few other species that have this feature, but remember that that is one of the defining features of this mushroom. So the vulva at the base, very important. Another important one is they have this skirt-like ring on the stem. Everybody see how it's wearing kind of a skirt on its stem there? So this ring is remnants of what's called the partial veil. So the egg is the universal veil, and this skirt is the partial veil. So when this mushroom first emerges out of that egg structure and is elongating to become its cap and stem form, that cap is still very bullet shaped, right? It's not flattened out into a dinner plate yet. And as the stem elongates and that bullet cap goes further into the air, once it reaches full height or almost full height, it will start to expand its cap. Now, all that time that is happening before that cap expands, the gills are covered with a membranous tissue that are meant to keep all those gills under the mushroom where the spores are produced, keep them nice and humid and protected from environmental problems like drying out or maybe getting too wet or insect damage, things like that. As the cap expands, that membrane snaps away and it is left behind on the ring as a stem. I'm sorry, left behind on the stem as a ring. So sometimes what can happen is this ring will not be there. Now, this is a common feature of this species, but sometimes it doesn't stay behind on the stem. Maybe it adheres to the outside of the cap instead, and it'll hang on the edge of the cap. So don't use this one as your only defining feature, but if you see that egg-like structure at the base of the stem and one of these floppy rings, then you know that you have probably found this poisonous mushroom. So there's a photo of that Amanita with that partial veil still covering the gills. So sometimes you'll find it when it's still kind of immature. You see that bullet-shaped cap not flattened out yet. And so you might think, oh, that one doesn't have a ring on the stem, but it just hasn't broken away yet. So beware of that. A couple more things about this mushroom. It is all white. The entire mushroom is gleaming white, and that's why it is destroying angel, right? Kind of a fitting name. It's all white, has a very smooth cap, and of course, the sac at the base of the stem. Those are your defining features. And you'll always find this one in hardwood forests, probably near oaks. Okay, so those deadly amanitas, very, very dangerous. Remember, bright white mushroom, smooth cap, floppy ring on the stem, and the egg at the base is the kicker. Sometimes, if you're just walking in the woods and you see a bright white umbrella-shaped mushroom, you can't tell that it's an amanita sometimes until you pull some leaves away from the base of the stem, or maybe even get a knife and kind of excavate it a little bit because that egg is down into the ground a little bit. So if you just go up to a mushroom and cut its stem and take it home and try to identify it, you have left behind the most important structure. So keep that in mind. All right, on to the deadly Galerina. This one's Galerina marginata. If ingested, this mushroom can also cause organ failure and death. In fact, it contains amanitans, which are the same toxins in those deadly amanita mushrooms. This is a very common mushroom, and actually you can find these guys almost all year round. I have seen them in the dead of winter. I have seen them in the summer. So very common mushroom, but they're pretty small. Their caps are generally under 2 inches across, and that's a big one, usually 1 to 1.5 inches average. So they're little brown mushrooms that grow on wood, and they have rusty brown spores. How many people have taken a spore print before? Oh, good, lots of hands. A spore print is simply cutting the stem off a mushroom, putting it down on a piece of paper and leaving it overnight, and then lifting the cap and looking at the spores that have fallen out of the cap overnight and determining their color. And it can be an identifying factor for mushrooms. So these mushrooms have rusty brown spores. They have a little ring on the stem. If you look really close, you can see the ring. And also, a lot of times you don't even have to do that spore print because one has been made for you in nature. See the brown right there on that ring? That is a deposit of spores that have fallen out of the gills and got stuck on that ring. So a lot of times there are some edible mushrooms that look similar to this one, but they would have white spores. So you would easily be able to tell them apart by knowing the spore color. So keep that in mind with this one. They do have that ring. They're very small, and they grow in little clusters on wood. Those are kind of the reliable ID factors. Here's some more photos of that mushroom. Pretty nondescript little brown mushroom, right? Just kind of this tawny brown color. They always grow from very well rotted wood. A couple more pictures. And again, they're small. See, that's a big close-up of my hand and my fingers. And you can also clearly see that ring on the stem in that one that has turned brown from that spore deposit. A couple more shots of them growing out of the wood there. And that brings us to the LBMs, or little brown mushrooms. So the deadly Galerina is the most important little brown mushroom to know, but as a group, it's a good way, especially as a beginner, to avoid a lot of problematic mushrooms by just avoiding little brown mushrooms. Just don't eat them. It's very simple. They're small, tan to brown, and they're very difficult to ID. A lot of these little brown mushrooms are difficult for even the most seasoned experts. So they're not worth the risk, because if you had 100 of those deadly Galerinas, you could fry them up, and I don't think there would be much to them at that point. So it really isn't worth the risk. Avoid little brown mushrooms. Really just avoid any little mushrooms. If they're really little mushrooms, they're not worth messing with, and they're probably hard to identify, almost always. So these LBMs can be found almost all year long. They grow on a whole bunch of different substrates. They can grow right in the grass, on dead logs, grow from mulch in your landscaping. They can grow right from the leaves on the floor of the forest. If it's little and brown, it could put you down. This is a common occurrence right here, is having little brown mushrooms growing right in your lawn. So be careful of those things. Some of them are very toxic. Most of them are not, but the toxic ones are definitely ones you don't want to mess with. On to the jack-o'-lanterns. I have an example of this mushroom up on the very far end of the table up here. People want to see it afterwards. This toxic species is one of the most common causes of mushroom poisonings in North America because it's often mistaken for a few different edible species of mushroom. How many people have heard of this mushroom before, the jack-o'-lantern? Good, lots of hands. So this one has a pumpkin orange color, right? Hence the name jack-o'-lantern mushrooms, kind of pumpkin-y looking color-wise. They grow in these big clusters on wood. Now, when I say they grow in big clusters on wood, that's what they usually do. And sometimes, though, you will find this mushroom's cluster a few feet out from a tree, usually a standing dead tree or an old rotten stump. So it might look like the cluster is growing from the ground, but it's actually growing from some buried roots that are just under the ground. So still growing from wood, but it can be deceiving because it looks like it's growing from the ground. So beware, this mushroom likes to do that a lot. So growth on wood in these clusters, the pumpkin orange color, and this mushroom doesn't have a ring on the stem. So a lot of mushrooms do, especially some of its edible counterparts like the honey mushrooms. So that's a good thing to remember. This one does cause severe GI distress, not a deadly poisonous mushroom. If you have existing health conditions, there is a possibility that you could die from eating this one, but generally it just lands you in the hospital for about 24 hours in severe GI distress. I think we all know what that means. You won't die, but you'll wish that you had. I stole a lot of these quotes from Maxine Stone, so thank her. Okay, the jack-o'-lantern is Omphalodus illudens. Couple more shots of that one. Here's the underside. You can see no ring on the stem. It's orange underneath, just like it's orange on the top. It's a gilled mushroom. They run just down the stem a little bit, and they are fused together at the base in a tight cluster. And here you can see where this old rotten tree had fallen over, and this cluster of jack-o'-lanterns is growing from what's left behind, some of the roots just under the ground, outside from the stump. That's a very common situation to find this mushroom in. And jack-o'-lanterns actually are bioluminescent fungi. So they're a glow-in-the-dark mushroom. Here in Missouri, we only have 3 species considered bioluminescent, and this is probably the one that you have the best chance of seeing the glow. So to see the glow, you need to find these jack-o'-lanterns when they're very fresh. If you find older, kind of rotting or fading ones, they don't tend to glow very well at all. But if you find some good fresh ones, take them in a completely dark room, maybe an inner bathroom or something like that, and just sit there with the mushroom cluster for 5 or 10 minutes. Let your eyes adjust to the dark, and you will see its eerie glow. You might feel kind of weird while you're sitting there with a big cluster of poisonous mushrooms, waiting for them to glow, but it's worth it, believe me. It's a lot of fun. Okay, so any questions about the toxic mushrooms? I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about anything I've talked about so far. Yes? You have a question? Go ahead. He said, are there animals that would be immune to eating the toxic mushrooms? Certainly, yes. So a lot of these mushrooms, you'll see that they've evidently been eaten by something. You know, they'll have bites taken out of them, perhaps rodents or turtles or turkeys or deer or things like that. There isn't very much data about, you know, which animals can eat which species. So there's not a lot out there, but if you spend some time in the woods trying to identify all the mushrooms you find, you'll soon learn that the toxic ones are eaten a lot. So interesting question. I don't know the answer. Yes, you have a question in the back?
Let me repeat that question for
Yes.
people on Zoom. Is it dangerous if you inhale spores?
Oh, good question. So spores are tiny microscopic particles, kind of like dust particles, right? If you inhale large amounts of them, they could certainly be bad for you. Or if you inhale moderate amounts of them all day long, like you work in a mushroom farm or something like that in an enclosed area. But as far as just through your general daily activities, it is perfectly okay to breathe spores. In fact, it is estimated that every breath that all of us have ever taken had at least 10 spores in every single breath, including all the breaths we're taking here today. So spores are ubiquitous. They fly around everywhere. They're everywhere in this room. They're everywhere outside in this park. And they're looking for food, right? They're looking for something to land on and germinate and break it down, basically. So perfectly okay to not worry about spores unless there's a bunch of them, like puffballs. Don't squeeze a puffball into your nose or anything like that, you know. So I know from personal, no, I'm just kidding.
So Mike,
I like mushrooms, but not that much.
I have a question too.
Yes.
So I've experienced this stuff called firefox before. One time I was living in a tent in the woods, and I got a hold of a mower, and I like mowed my little patch, and then that night it was like the stars like lit up on the forest floor, and it was all this bioluminescence. I was kind of curious if that was mycelium from the jack-o'-lantern, or if you have any ideas about that.
You hit it. Yes, it was probably, so the term foxfire is for glowing things in the dark, and it's always been very mysterious. If you look in old kind of reports about it, folk reports usually, but it is mycelium of fungi of mushrooms in the genus Armillaria, or honey mushrooms. They have a bioluminescent mycelium, and that is where the phenomenon of foxfire comes from. Pretty cool stuff. I envy you because I've never seen it before. Yes?
Question from Zoom here. What are the other bioluminescent mushrooms found, and where can you find them?
Well, one of them is Armillaria species that Steve just mentioned. Steve, Sorry. So that would be the second one. And then also a small little mushroom called Panella stypticus, or the bitter oysterling, is another bioluminescent mushroom. Very, very common, one of the most common mushrooms in our area. And they make these little bitty kind of stacked shelf mushrooms that have gills underneath them. And they glow, especially when they're very fresh. They don't glow as brightly as the jack-o'-lanterns in my experience, but if you find a chunk of wood with a bunch of them on it and they're fresh, take them home and take them in that bathroom or whatever dark place you have. Take both so you can, if you have a jack-o'-lantern and a Panella stypticus, they can compete and see which one's brighter. Another interesting thing about many of these bioluminescent fungi, especially Panella stypticus, is that their mycelium is sometimes bioluminescent, and you can actually grow them on a block of sawdust, which will then glow. So it's kind of like a nightlight in a bag. Pretty fun.
One more over here, Mike.
What do you think the most toxic mushroom is?
The most toxic mushroom. That's a good question, but you know what? That destroying angel that I was telling you about is certainly up towards the top of the list. It is very, very toxic. You definitely don't want to eat that one. So that would be my answer. Yep, the destroying angel. That's why I make sure and put it in that talk, because it's the most important poisonous mushroom to learn. Good question. All right, so Missouri has dozens of edible mushroom species just waiting to be experienced. So I'm going to show you the edible mushrooms of Missouri's bottomlands. This is Sericium erinaceus, or the lion's mane mushroom, one of my favorite shots of that one. And all of these edible mushrooms I'm going to show you, it's a handful of species. I'll tell you a little bit how to identify and find them. These are all mushrooms that can be found in the big river bottoms. They can also be found in lots of other places, right? Any kind of wet area, low area, creek bottoms, all of these mushrooms are common there, and even in other environments. But you can definitely find them all in the bottomlands. And I'm also going to show you a little bit about how to prepare them in some ways that I've tried. So here we go. This is what everybody's here for. How long have I been talking? Hey. All right, that's what I do. Sorry. One last warning. All mushrooms are edible. Some only once. When in doubt, throw it out. There's that Amanita destroying angel. This one is actually Amanita amarivirosa. So it's another one of the destroying angels. And actually, I found this one on a foray with Mr. Brian Lunu's right over there. You remember finding that one? It was fun. All right. So why even forage for fungi? Why are these things so popular all of a sudden? And what is the big deal? Well, forage mushrooms provide a free source of unique flavors, textures, and even nutrition, which are available for most of the year. There are some good wild mushroom edibles almost all year round. Maybe not like February. It's my least favorite month. So a wide range of culinary and medicinal uses of mushrooms go back thousands of years for some of these things. The medicinal mushrooms like reishi and shiitake and maitake, all of those, there's documentation of being used a long time. And of course, eating mushrooms has been a common human practice for as long as we've been around, I would assume. So here in Missouri, we have a relatively small number of dangerous fungi, and they can easily be avoided by learning to identify them. So that's what we were doing just now, is learning those most toxic ones. And foraging for mushrooms is a great way to interact with nature, which we are all in great need of these days, right? And a valuable skill to learn or teach. This is my handmade basket of full of chanterelles. I think I overdid it a little bit because I don't know if I could fit even one more in there. All right. Maybe this is what you guys have all been waiting for, is this one right here, huh? I like to talk about the morels first because they're generally the first edible mushroom to appear after the long cold winter. And I think that's part of their appeal to people is, oh man, I'm so tired of the cold and I'm ready to go hiking. And oh, there's a delicious mushroom out there too. So this one is restricted to the springtime. You can only find them in the spring. I'm particularly going to talk about the yellow morel, Morchella americana, the one in the photo. That's the most common morel that we have here in Missouri, and the one that's usually found in the most abundance and the most commonly recognized. So these are considered to be mycorrhizal mushrooms, so they're forming that beneficial relationship with trees. But interestingly, this type of mushroom is also thought to be saprobic upon the death of their host. Sometimes, not always. when a yellow morel lives with an elm tree. So it has a symbiotic relationship with elm tree roots. And it can live with that elm tree for as long as the tree lives, which could be a couple hundred years for some of those big old elms. The whole time it'll put out a few fruit bodies a year to get some spores into the environment and spread its genetics a little bit. But what happens when those big elm trees die and they've had that morel fungus on their roots all that time? The morel fungus somehow knows that the tree has died, or maybe even that it is about to die and it hasn't died yet. And it will kick into overdrive, start to decay its host that has lived with all that time, kind of insidious, right? And then it will use the nutrition that it gains from breaking down that elm tree to make as many fruit bodies as possible. So when you see pictures of these guys who are out turkey hunting and they have their whole tailgate covered with morels, they were probably walking along a big river somewhere and probably stumbled upon an old, dead, or dying elm tree or cottonwood tree. It can happen with as well. And they found a couple hundred of them under a tree. That's not always the case, but my friend Willie May, who is a morel hunting legend here in Missouri, has found trees with over 500 morels under them. One tree. Isn't that amazing? So when you get a really big elm tree and it dies, the fungus goes nuts and starts making all those mushrooms. Sadly, it only does that for a couple of years. Once the tree is completely dead, you won't find morels there anymore. So you got to find a new dead or dying elm tree, right? So here in the Ozarks, morels seem to prefer elm trees, American elm or slippery elm, ash trees, which unfortunately are severely on the decline due to the emerald ash borer. And I don't have any ash trees on my property anymore. When I first moved there were dozens, and they all made morels. So kind of sad that they all died, right? Also, cottonwood trees are great. I don't have a lot of experience with cottonwoods because I don't live by a big river, and that's predominantly where their habitat is. But those cottonwoods can really make a lot of morels. I just found about a dozen morels under a cottonwood the other day, and it was one that had been planted on purpose, the tree, so that's kind of neat. So if you hit creek bottoms or along those big rivers, you're sure to find some morels as long as the time is right. So they can be very plentiful, and morels generally show up in the same areas each year, and that's because they're living with those trees that you find them growing near. So that's how people develop their honey holes, right? So you just need to be in the right places at the right times. There are lots of old wives' tales about how to know if the morels are coming out. There are lots of technical things to find out, like the soil temperature and the rainfall and all the averages over the last 20 years of when the new morels were found. But I like to stick to more natural signs that it's time to go check my morel spots. And my top ones are when the dogwoods are newly in full bloom. So there's this interesting transition between the redbud trees, which are highly visible, right? We see them all around right now, and they're wonderful, right? So once the flowers in those redbud trees start to wither and kind of fade, and the dogwoods have become completely white, they're yellowish kind of for a little while, right? It takes them a bit to open up fully. When those dogwoods are bright white and the redbuds are at the very end of their flowering, that is the perfect time to go check for morels. Another one is when the oak leaves break leaf buds. So when those leaves are about the size of a mouse's ear. I've also heard squirrel's ear. I don't know what the difference between those two ears is size-wise, but when they're about this big. So those are really good things to look for. And it just so happens that that time in the natural progression of springtime is right now. So this talk is perfectly timed for morels. Any of you could go out tomorrow in a place near here, hit the creek bottoms and look for some elm trees, and I bet you'll find a morel right now. So those are my favorite indicators. People can be very secretive about their honey holes, so don't ask. I've been led on many wild goose chases. When I first started learning about mushrooms, I live in a very small town. I'd go to the oil, get my oil changed. There'd be some old timers in there, and I hear mushroom, and I perk up, say, "Oh, you know where some mushrooms are, huh? Let me know." And they just kind of look over at me like, "Oh yeah, we know where some are. Tell me some big, long, rambling tale about go this way down the gravel road and this side of the river." And then I go there, and of course, there were no morels there, and not even signs of any habitat for morels. So they pulled a fast one on me. So yeah, don't even ask. Save yourself the trouble. Morels are hollow, so they often end up being cozy homes for a variety of creatures, mostly bugs, but sometimes larger critters are discovered in there. This is a salamander inside that morel. I reached down and snipped that stem with my knife, and I saw something wiggling next to the stem butt, and I looked closer, and it was the salamander's tail. So I had clipped his tail by cutting that morel. He was inside the morel. That was really fun. Since this was the first time this happened to me, since then, I have found 5 salamanders inside morels. Pretty fun. So yeah, I think they like it in there. It's like air conditioned inside, you know, it's safe, food source maybe, I don't know. Don't they eat bugs probably, right? So slice those morels crossways into rings. This gives them this wonderful crispy texture on the inside and outside when fried. If you like fried morels, do this next time. Also, you can pretend they're your eyes like my kiddo there. Lots of fun. They're also really good on pizza like this, my friend Lisa Suits told me. So just take those things, roll them in some seasoned flour. You can use gluten-free or crumbs or cornmeal or whatever you want. Season it up really good with whatever you like, lots of salt. Dip it in a milk and egg mixture, then go back into the flour and then fry them. And that's how you get that really, really good crispy exterior on those fried morels. This is one I just threw in this talk because I just took this photo a couple weeks ago, or these photos. This is an immature black morel, and it is showing fluorescence under UV light. So when black morels are very immature, like this one, you can shine a black light on them and they glow purple. Most mushrooms don't do that, so that's pretty cool. So on to the Gyrometra species, or false morels. I'm not a fan of the term false morels. I feel like it's a little derogatory toward this poor mushroom that is not trying to be a morel, right? It's its own thing and really not that much like a morel when it comes down to it. So keep in mind with these things, in northern states, so north of here, the northern Midwest, also in the Pacific Northwest, and even in the Rocky Mountains, there are very toxic species of Gyrometra, and they must be specially prepared to safely consume them. How many people are familiar with a false morel? Like they know what that is. They've seen it in the book as a skull and crossbones, right? So there are very toxic species of this. And strangely, here in Missouri, this was perplexing to me when I first started learning about mushrooms. They have a long history of being eaten, despite being considered deadly poisonous in field guides, right? Missouri's Wild Mushrooms Department of Conservation, it has a skull and crossbones. It will kill you if you eat it. So it turns out that here in Missouri, we have 3 species of these Gyrometra, or lorchels, as I like to call them. And none of the 3 species that occur here in Missouri are toxic. So we have found that out over the last several decades of pretty good observations in the field and talking to people who regularly eat them. But over the last 2 or 3 years, I can't remember when the study was, 2 years ago, I think, they did a really nice study where they got samples of a whole bunch of different species of these things. And they found that the 3 species that grow here in Missouri are not toxic. They do not contain gyrometrin, which is a substance that is deadly poisonous that does exist in some species of this genus, just not the ones that grow here in Missouri. So we're very lucky to be able to eat these delicious mushrooms and not worry about being poisoned as long as you cook them all the way. So this one is Gyrometra brunea, commonly called elephant ears, really cool looking mushroom. Not very commonly found. This is the one that most people are usually familiar with, the big red lorchel, Gyrometra caroliniana. It's a very brain-like mushroom. It has these caps that are made of wrinkles and folds rather than pits and ridges of a regular true morel. They have this massive chalk white stem. And when you cut these mushrooms in half, they're not hollow on the inside like a morel. They'll often have hollow areas, but we call them chambered. So they're mostly flesh inside, but not hollow from top to bottom like a morel. They're very common in early spring. They're out there right now, and you'll usually find them growing near rotting stumps or piles of old debris in the forest. And alongside big rivers is a really good place to look for this mushroom. Sometimes you'll see a whole bunch of them in one spot. Very cool mushroom. Even if you don't eat it, they can grow to enormous sizes. Species of several pounds have been reported. I saw a picture of an 8-pound big red lorchel. It was bigger than my head, and I have a big head. It was a huge mushroom like this. It really looked like a giant brain. So it's a good, safe edible. When fully cooked, it's very important. And that brings me to one thing that I like to say in the morel section of this talk is that morels are actually toxic when raw or even undercooked. So the most commonly eaten mushroom that everyone here has heard of is actually a toxic mushroom if eaten raw. There have been several cases of poisonings. Just a couple of years ago in Minnesota, a sushi restaurant bought a bunch of morels on the market, didn't really know how to cook them or know anything about them, just knew that they would sell good, right? And they made sushi and a few other either uncooked or just very slightly cooked products. And a lot of people got sick. 40 people, I think, were hospitalized, and 2 people lost their lives from eating raw or undercooked morels. So don't be scared to eat morels, just cook them first, right? Same thing with these lorchels, make sure you cook them. A couple more shots of that one, very brain-like. This wonderful brick red color, lots of lobes and wrinkles. And here's the interior. You can see what I mean by that chambered interior. See how there are hollow areas, but it's mostly flesh inside. Very cool mushroom. Yes.
So how do you know when it's fully cooked?
How do you know when it's fully cooked? Ah, good question. So if you're really worried about it, you can saute the mushrooms instead of deep frying them. And if you saute a mushroom until you get caramelization on it, you can be sure that it's fully cooked. Yeah. Otherwise, you can boil a mushroom for about 5 minutes and then prepare it otherwise. So I usually just like to cook them longer than I normally would and just make sure that they're really, really cooked, especially the lorchels or the gyrometra. They're a very meaty, dense mushroom. You got to cut them really, really small or make sure that they're cooked really well. Yeah. You'll kind of notice on that one if it isn't cooked all the way because it's all weird and rubbery inside. Any other questions on that one? It's kind of a controversial subject. Yes?
Is that what some people call the red morel?
Yes, some people do call
Is-
it the red morel.
Okay,
Yes,
I was
yes.
trying to get that straight. And I thought, I've always been told that they're found more in the hilly areas rather than the riverbanks. Is that just a hearsay?
They can occur in either place, really. What this mushroom needs to be found is old, big trees and their stumps. That's the habitat for this mushroom. I often find them in people's yards. I'll get pictures of mushrooms. Mike, what's this weird mushroom? It'll be right in the yard on a stump, but they're pretty common in the lower areas, not flooded areas. So you want to get up out of the flood zone.
Right.
I know that's kind of hard right now, but yeah, they're not going to grow like right on the edge, probably not, but they're very common in the big river areas, especially like St. Louis area on the very end of the Merrimack where it gets really big and then it flows into the Mississippi and Missouri, all those bottomland forests along there, prime red lorchel territory. Yes.
And I also have, I've always, another thing is, you were talking about the insects in your morels or whatever might be
Yes.
living in it.
Right.
I've always been told to soak them in salt water and it kind of runs those. I don't know. Is that something
So
also?
you're not alone. Lots of people say to do that. I'm not sure where that practice came from, but it is simply unnecessary and it can only degrade the quality of the mushroom, in my opinion. So
Right.
what I try to do, if they have a bunch of those little bouncy springtails on them, I usually find that a good spray of water works really good, like from your sprayer on your sink. Just spray those little guys off of there. Let the mushrooms sit on a towel or something for an hour or two till all the moisture evaporates, and then put them in a paper sack in the fridge. And generally that will get rid of enough bugs where you won't notice. But otherwise, you end up with a soggy mushroom, in my opinion. So please don't soak your morels, everybody.
Also, I noticed that you snipped with scissors. You can just pinch them off, but I was always told leave that lower part in the soil. Is that why you
You are
snip yours?
asking great morel questions. This is great. These are like all the big ones. I love this. So it's okay to cut them or to pull them out of the ground. Like I said in the beginning of the talk, if you pull that mushroom out of the ground, it doesn't injure anything or disturb anything under the ground. So the morel fungus is still going to live there with the tree roots, whether you pull it out or cut it. Now, when you pull a morel out of the ground, it has a bunch of dirt at the base, right? So usually I'll pull them out and I'll cut that dirty part off, and then I'll just kind of stick it back in the hole. Yeah, that's my common practice. I don't know if that helps, but it makes me feel good. So you don't really want to just cut them on the ground. I mean, you can do that, it's fine, but the stem is equally edible to the rest. So I like to get it all, right? Okay, on to the chanterelles, Cantharellus species. These gorgeous mushrooms are actually the most commonly eaten mushroom, wild mushroom in the world. And they can be quite abundant here in our Ozarks woods. How many people have tried chanterelles? Oh, God, that's awesome. That's more hands than I've ever seen in a room, I got to say. That's fantastic. So one of my very favorite mushrooms, and really a pretty well-kept secret here in Missouri, right? This mushroom is everywhere through the summertime, and not very many people seem to be too excited about them. This mushroom grows directly from the ground, never from wood. So you're not going to find like a bunch of chanterelles growing from an old stump or something like that. And they are mycorrhizal fungi, and they're partners with oak trees. So that's why we have so many chanterelles here in our region. They grow with oaks, and we have tons of them, right? You'll find them growing right next to the destroying angels sometimes, hanging out with the oak trees. So look for the chanterelles in midsummer near oak trees. Some years they are everywhere. This one is the golden chanterelle, Cantharellus cibarius in quotes. That is the name for the European golden chanterelle. It turns out that we have a whole bunch of golden chanterelles here in North America, and many of them are as yet unnamed. So this is one of the tastiest mushrooms of all time. A pile of them smells intriguingly fruity like apricots. And again, the most eaten wild mushroom on the planet, these golden chanterelles specifically. This variety has a set of gill-like structures under the cap. Now, real gills, you can scrape them with your finger. Think the bottom of a portobello. You can kind of scrape your finger along those gills and they come right off, right? And you can see the flesh underneath where the gills broke off. You can't do that with one of these. These gill-like structures are part of the fleshy part of the mushroom. So if you run your finger on them, they may crumble a little bit, especially if it's older, but they don't separate in a separate layer. So I put gills in quotation marks. Often you'll see them referred to as false gills. Again, I don't like that term. It's just, they are gills, really. They look like the same. One thing that's different about chanterelle gills is they often have these little cross veins that go between the gills. Now, some other gilled mushrooms have that as well, but not very many of them. And a lot of chanterelles have that have these gills. So the golden chanterelle is not as common in the Ozarks as the smooth undersided relative of that mushroom, which I'll show you in a second. I want to show you this comparison of a jack-o'-lantern underside with a chanterelle underside. So the sharp blade-like gills of a jack-o'-lantern, they're very thin, stacked all together. You can see there are no side veins in there. And you can see these blunt gill-like ridges of the chanterelle. Now, at first glance, though, they look pretty similar, right? So you can see why people would mistake these mushrooms for one another, especially when they haven't ever done that before, try to figure them out. So be very careful. The reason the jack-o'-lantern is so commonly such a common source of mushroom poisoning is because it looks like this mushroom a little bit. So when you're picking the chanterelles that are gilled, make sure that you know what you're doing. This is my best tip for telling the two apart. On the left is a jack-o'-lantern cut in half, and on the right is a chanterelle torn in half. So when torn in half lengthwise, jack-o'-lanterns have an orange interior, not quite as orange as the outside, but still definitely orange. They're fleshy inside, so kind of like any other mushroom stem that you're probably thinking in your mind, and their gills are distinctly separate. And when you cut them in half like this, you can really see what I'm talking about. See the lighter flesh layer and then the darker gills? So you can see they're definitely separate. Now, when you tear a chanterelle in half, they are bright white on the inside, so not orange, right? And not even yellow. And the kicker is their texture. You can see it really clearly in the photo. They have this stringy texture that reminds me of string cheese or a chicken strip torn in half, kind of. So watch for that texture, and that is the best way to tell these two mushrooms apart. If you're confused about the false gills and the clusters and the growing on wood and stuff, this is what you do. I always like to show that feature. Now, the smooth chanterelle, Cantharellus flavolatericius, it's very similar to that golden chanterelle with the gills. Slightly less sought after, and they just aren't quite as flavorful, but they're still awesome. So these are also very abundant in our oak forest. Some years, many baskets can be filled, and this one gets really big. So if you've ever found those big wavy chanterelles that look like a big old flower, it was probably Cantharellus flavolatericius. They're often very, very completely smooth on the underside, but sometimes you can see they're covered with a series of wrinkles. Here's a photo of some summertime jackpot from a couple of years ago. So like I said, chanterelles can be quite abundant. These were all picked in a few hours at one of our neighbors' farms, and we were pretty happy. That's about 25 pounds of chanterelles and about 5 pounds of black trumpets in the center. We got sweaty, but we ate good. So dry sauteing is the secret to cooking with these chanterelles and lots of other mushrooms. I'm going to tell you how to do it. Tear apart your mushrooms and add to a hot skillet. I like to use cast iron, get it good and hot. Saute those mushrooms until they release all the liquid that they contain. It'll be obvious when that happens. Cook them until that liquid has evaporated, and then add your butter and oil and saute them a few minutes more to darken them, brown them, caramelize them. And at that point, you have a perfectly cooked chanterelle that can be used for all kinds of different things. Put them in egg dishes, omelets, or quiche, or scrambled eggs. You can put them on pizza, like in the photo here, or even just on toast. So dry saute, highly recommend. Let's see, we have some really nice chanterelles there. These were some just really perfect immature ones that had not become frilly. They didn't have any bugs in them. And this was part of that big giant haul that you saw. When you have that many mushrooms and you don't sell them, you have to think of ways to use them all, right? So we got busy and I did some things that I'd never done before with chanterelles. First, we deep fried them, just like a morel, which I had never thought to do before, but someone told me that it worked. I was skeptical because they have a really firm texture, and usually I cook them for a pretty good amount of time, so it'd be hard to deep fry, but these things were awesome. I'm definitely going to do it again this year. Also made some, oh, there they are with the nice Thai sauce, so good stuff. Also made some conserve. This is a pickled mushroom that has oil in the mix. You cook them in some oil, then add to vinegar and pickle them, keep them in the fridge. This is like gold at my house. I make 1 or 2 jars of this a year and nobody else is allowed to eat them, only me. And they last a long time, so everybody is always trying to get them and I'm watching. So next we have some chanterelle jerky. Can you see the underside of that chanterelle there? You can tell what it is. It takes a lot of mushrooms to make jerky, so people don't generally use chanterelles for it, but when you have a whole bunch and they're starting to get kind of old in the fridge, it's time to take action, right? Make some jerky. How many people have tried mushroom jerky? Cool. You're missing out if you haven't. Good stuff. You can make it with almost any mushroom. It's amazing. All right, black trumpets, Craterellus phalanx. One of the best mushrooms and one of my absolute favorite. Very hard to mistake for any other, so really good beginner mushroom. They're black. There just aren't very many black trumpet-shaped mushrooms. Black trumpet, yeah. The earthy scent is incomparable. One of their names is poor man's truffles. So truffles, one of the most expensive foods on the planet. They're a fungus. And the smell of black trumpets has been said to be a little bit like them. I don't think so, but they have a wonderful earthy scent all their own. Beautiful mushroom. They grow scattered or in small groups directly from the ground, often in mossy areas. You can see at the base of this nice cluster there, they're grown right out of some moss. They're mycorrhizal with oak trees, so look for black trumpets in oak forests. Also, I like to look on slopes and where the woods are kind of open. There's not a lot of understory, and then there's kind of some mossy patches mixed in. That's where you find the black trumpets. And they grow in the summertime. So once you spot one, make sure that you stop and look around, maybe get down real low and look around because there almost always are more around. I have found myself in the middle of dozens of black trumpets that I didn't even see 2 seconds earlier. You have a question?
Yes, I'm wondering which of these are most attractive to animals? Which ones are we going to have to fight the animals for?
Well, if you include insects in animals, you're going to have to fight for every single mushroom, basically. But yeah, animals seem to like bigger, fleshier mushrooms, it seems like. I have a great deer cam photo of a deer with a big old bolete in its mouth, a big giant hamburger bun looking mushroom. So I'm not sure if they eat chanterelles. I don't think I've noticed like chanterelles bit off at the stem kind of thing. I have noticed that morels are apparently eaten by some critter. I can't prove it was a deer, but that's what I think it was. So they can be hard to spot, but make sure you look around if you see some. These are some chanterelles that I found just in one day right outside my door at my house in my creek bottom. So 4 different species at least there, and delicious. Chicken of the woods, Laetiparus sulphureus. Great beginner mushroom too, because very easy to identify with its bright orange top and bright yellow underside. It's found on dead, dying, or fallen hardwoods in the spring through fall. Not a rare mushroom and can be quite large. This cluster was about 20 pounds. This mushroom can be used in basically any chicken recipe with good results. So that's how it has its name. Not because it looks like a chicken, but because its texture is very meaty. So it's perfect for vegetarian diets, and also it's perfect for fooling carnivores in your life. It's a lot of fun, pretty convincing. Sometimes only the edges of this mushroom are tender enough to saute, but those inner parts can still be used if you boil them for a good amount of time or pressure cook them is ideal. One warning, this mushroom has been known to cause GI distress in a small percentage of individuals, but that percentage seems to be a little higher than a lot of other wild mushrooms, about 10%. So this is a great one to try just a small amount the first time you try this mushroom. Wait till the next day. If you don't have any adverse effects, then go ahead and pick out. See if it agrees with you. Also, there's a white poor chicken, Latipris cincinnatus. This one is orange on top with a white underside rather than bright yellow. It also grows from the spring into fall, but it doesn't grow in stacks of shelves up the side of a dead or dying tree or on a fallen log growing down the side of the log in shelves. This one likes to grow in a rosette pattern where all of these kind of shelfy things are coming out of one core, and they almost always are fruiting at the base of dead or dying hardwoods or from their old rotten stumps, right at the base of the tree where the tree touches the ground. There's a couple photos of some fun finds. That was a huge one. That's the close-up photo in the previous photo. So this is my daughter smelling one that we found. You always got to smell the mushroom, right? So here's something I like to do with these guys. Break them into manageable pieces. Boil this mushroom for about 10 minutes. You don't have to do that if you find a very immature one that's still kind of bubbling out of the tree or the ground. Popcorn chicken, we like to call them. You don't need to boil those. They're going to be super tender, and if you boil them, it might mess them up. So if you find some of these fully mature ones, though, boil it 10 minutes. And this greatly reduces the chances of GI distress. So keep that in mind, because the mushroom will be fully cooked before you cook it again, right? So the more you cook a mushroom, the more digestible it generally is. Boil 10 minutes. You can just batter and deep fry these things just like chicken strips. Serve them with a dipping sauce. People will generally not know the difference. This is one of my favorite things I've made with this mushroom, some chicken enchiladas. So take those chicken of the woods pieces, sear them in a really hot cast iron, saute up some onions and garlic and other aromatics, and then put it all in a pressure cooker. I like to use my little Instant Pot. Those things are great, right? Put it in the Instant Pot. Give it 10 minutes in that thing, get it really cooked, and look at this stuff when you take it out of that Instant Pot. Shred it up, and it looks just like shredded chicken. And if you cook it with the right stuff, it tastes like it too. You can make all kinds of stuff with this, from pulled barbecue chicken to anything you can think of that you would make with shredded chicken. I like to make enchiladas, so I just saute the mushroom again with some more onions and stuff, mix in some more seasonings, make a nice enchilada sauce. Roll them in the tortillas, cover them with lots of cheese, and bake them. So chicken enchiladas. If you make chicken enchiladas with a chicken of the woods, you can't even tell that it is not chicken. It's amazing. Lion's mane, Hericium erinaceus. This is a mildly parasitic mushroom and saprobic, so it's breaking down dead wood. Fairly common on dead or dying black oaks, sometimes white oaks. Most common in the fall, but also found in spring and even summer. When I first started hunting mushrooms, this was a fall mushroom. You really just didn't see it much in the spring, but that has changed over the last decade or so, and it's found pretty frequently in the spring, especially along larger waterways. So there you go. This mushroom has a very unique texture and flavor, similar to crab or lobster meat. So perfect in as a seafood substitute in hot or cold recipes. Anything you can think of to make with crab or lobster, you can use this mushroom to make. There are some exciting studies showing neuroregenerative properties, which is pretty amazing. How many people have heard of this mushroom before? Almost everyone, right? This mushroom is certainly having a moment over the last few years, and a lot of it has to do with these neuroregenerative properties that are apparent with this mushroom. So healthy and delicious, can't go wrong, right? A couple of shots of us finding those. Sometimes they're way up in a tree. I got that one, but I've seen them 25, 30 feet up, and I just had to look at it sadly. Leave it behind. There usually are more. So this is the comb tooth, Hericium coralloides, very close relative to the lion's mane, but instead of having those dangly teeth that all come from one attachment point, kind of like a cheerleader pom-pom hanging in the tree, this one has a more branched growth habit. So it branches out in all these branches, and all the branches are decorated with these dangly spines. The texture of this mushroom is even more crab-like, makes a convincing crab salad or any other seafood thing you can think of. Looks like some sea coral. A couple more shots to that one. So the lion's mane generally you'll find on a fallen tree that has fallen over and is dead, or on a standing, living or dead tree. Can be found, right? One of those balls of spines hanging right on the side of it. But this mushroom, you generally only find it on trees that are long dead and have fallen over and are touching the ground. That's generally where I find them. And a lot of times they're growing out from under the log, right where the log kind of touches the ground. You'll find it right there at the base. So keep an eye out. it can be a little harder to find because of that. Lion's mane is amazing. You don't even need a knife to get this thing into manageable pieces. Just pull it all apart, shred it up. You can take those shreds, give them a saute, make sure you add lots of Old Bay to really trick yourself into thinking that it's seafood, and then put some mayonnaise, some red onions. You can make a lobster roll, super delicious. This is like the easiest thing to make with a lion's mane. Highly recommend it. You can also do a similar thing. This is made with comb tooth, I believe, in the photo. That could be lion's mane, I can't tell. So boil the mushroom for 10 minutes, and then take that mushroom and squeeze all the liquid out of it, and then mix it with some breadcrumbs, some onions, some seasonings, some egg. Anybody see where I'm going with this? Crab cakes, right? Everybody loves crab cakes, right? So these, if you make crab cakes from a lion's mane that you prepare properly, you cannot tell that it isn't fancy crab cakes from some restaurant. So I hope you all get to try those. All right, oyster mushrooms. Pleurotus ostratus, this is one of the best ones to look for in the big river bottoms, right? This is a saprobic mushroom. It grows on wood. What do you see along the river? Lots of crashed down trees, right? Big old elm trees or sycamores, you know, that are as big around as your car or whatever, laying on the ground. Oyster mushrooms love that kind of habitat. So big rotten logs, if you have those, you're gonna get oyster mushrooms eventually. They grow in clusters on dying, dead, or fallen hardwoods. They can be found practically year-round if the winter is mild. There's even a summer oyster that's a different species, only grows in the summertime. As far as for food, they're very similar and don't really need to know the difference as long as you know what an oyster is. So they're a gray, brownish to white mushroom, often mostly white with a little bit of gray. And also, they're often found when not many other mushrooms are out. So that makes the oyster mushroom a really valuable one to know. A couple more pictures, you can see those gray colorations that sometimes show up. They usually grow in clusters like this, sometimes very large clusters. Oyster mushrooms are pretty easy to learn, although they're not the easiest mushroom to learn, like a chicken of the woods or a morel, but there are a few other large white gill mushrooms that grow directly from wood. And if you look at this photo of the underside of an oyster mushroom, you can see the key feature of this species, one of the key features. Their gills run down what little stem they have. Can you see how the gills just go all the way down to that attachment point? Sometimes they won't quite make it to the very bottom of where it attaches to the wood, but they're always running down the stem, which we call decurrent. So watch out for that. There aren't a whole lot of big white mushrooms with decurrent gills that grow on wood all year round. Sometimes they don't have a stem at all. Sometimes there is a little stem, especially in the summer oyster. It has a little bit more of a stem to it, but those gills still run way down the stem. This mushroom is delicious in eggs. I love it in egg dishes. Throw it in some scrambled eggs or omelet. But you can use it just like a button mushroom in the store, basically. Very versatile mushroom, very pleasing. It's a saprobic mushroom and it is very commonly grown. So most people, if you like to eat mushrooms, you probably eat an oyster mushroom by now. If you see someone selling mushrooms at the farmer's market, they invariably have oyster mushrooms. So very easy to grow, but the wild ones, I don't know, there's something about them that is even tastier. And they usually have a better texture because they're really dense, growing on a big log instead of a bag of sawdust. This is the summer oyster, Pleurotus pulmonarius. You can see that it has a little bit more of a stem structure under it a lot of times, but the gills still go down the stem. So very similar mushroom and equally tasty. A little bit about medicinal and functional mushrooms. This could be an entire presentation itself. I should take that sentence out because it is an entire presentation. I do. So this is Trametes versicolor, the turkey tail, one of my favorite medicinal mushrooms. Very easy to identify. It has bands of color. It's a little bit fuzzy and it has these blue and gray tones, which really does a good job, especially the blues, separating it from other little shelf-like mushrooms. And of course, it's white and porous on the underside. So I call it Missouri's medicine forest. Many species of mushrooms have been shown to contain anti-tumor, antimicrobial, and immunomodulating compounds. There are numerous local species that are easily found and abundant, and many of these have been shown to have possible medicinal benefits. You can make liquid and powdered extracts that are simple and economical to make at home with lots of these different medicinal mushrooms. So basically, the price of a big jug of Everclear, you can make a couple gallons of mushroom extract. So don't pay $40 for 2 ounces. This is Ganoderma applanatum. There's some examples of that up on my table here. Of course, the turkey tail, lion's mane, great medicinal mushroom. Schizophilum commune is a lesser known one, but it's been shown to have some really cool medicinal properties recently. And it's one of the most common mushrooms on the planet, found on all continents but Antarctica. Also, the auricularia species or wood ear are a very common medicinal and edible mushroom that we have. How many people have eaten wood ear before? I'm always curious. Ooh, that's a lot. Great. Man, you guys are great here. I love all these hands shooting up with all the mushroom questions. Sometimes I'll do like a little public library, in a tiny town, and it's 0 hands when I ask the questions. So it's great. Okay, a couple of regional field guide recommendations. Missouri's Wild Mushrooms by my friend Maxine Stone, published by Missouri Department of Conservation. It does have some errors in it, and a lot of the taxonomy in it is outdated, but it is still a great guide, especially for beginning mushroom hunters. It has a little over 100 species in it, kind of breaks them down, lots of good recipes, and just really presented pretty well for the beginner. Again, you want to seek out regional field guides. So all the mushrooms in the book you could potentially find yourself, rather than mushrooms of North America with 1,000 mushrooms in it where it's really difficult to kind of wade through them. Also, mushrooms in the Midwest. This is written by a couple of guys from Central Illinois, and they did a really great job of kind of cataloging the most common couple hundred mushrooms of the Midwest. Really good book. Edible Wild Mushrooms in Missouri and surrounding mushrooms of Illinois and surrounding states. This is a great one if you're just interested in edible mushrooms. It is full of fantastic photographs of side-by-side pictures of lookalikes and edibles, lots of great recipes. And Joe McFarland, the author of the book, the co-author, has a wonderful writing style. He's very witty. I'm jealous. 100 Edible Mushrooms, pretty good too. So I would like to plug the Missouri Mycological Society one more time. We're a nonprofit dedicated to spreading public awareness about mushrooms. The club hosts forays and mushroom-focused events all year long. Go to momyco.org to join the club. It's only $20 a year for your whole family. It's a nonprofit, and all the money goes back to offering forays, weekend campouts, classes, workshops, all kinds of stuff. Definitely worth it, but you can join us on forays for free, so keep that in mind. And be sure to check out that Missouri Mycological Society Facebook group. Lots of experts on there that are glad to help you figure out what mushrooms you found. So it's a really valuable resource for our region. And please, everybody, remember to check out my website, wildwisebotanicals.com. Please go follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We're very active on there. If you want to learn about mushrooms, this is a great way to kind of know what's happening right around you in the mushroom world. Okay, so that's all I have for the presentation. I think I made it. Thank you. Thank you so much. And do we have time for some questions? I don't know how much time we have. We do.
We got a question online. When has a mushroom exceeded its ideal picking time? What should we look for?
Oh, that's a good question. When has a mushroom exceeded its ideal picking time? So all mushrooms are different. There aren't very many blanket statements, but look for discoloration, usually browning, things getting a little thinner around the edges, changes in coloration, lots of insect damage, possibly surface mold growing on them. A lot of mushrooms are pretty tough. They can hang around for a long time, so you definitely want to learn how to pick them when they're good. Look for vibrant colors. When we're talking about polypores like chicken of the woods or hen of the woods, things like that, when they're still actively growing, the edges of the shelves are round and blunt. Once they're finished growing, and that means they'll be tougher texture-wise, the edges of the shelves will be much thinner. So that's a good tip for those kind. Yes?
Yeah, I noticed you didn't talk about boletes at all.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is that they're hard to identify. Is that correct? Talking about boletes.
Boletes,
But
yes.
there
That's
are-
one of the reasons they're not in this talk.
Right, but we do, but most of them are not poisonous. If I'm
Certainly,
correct.
yes. There are no deadly poisonous boletes in our area, and there are only a few that are suspected to be mildly poisonous. Lots of people eat them. So boletes are a very safe group of mushrooms. If you don't know, boletes are a cap and stem mushroom with a really fleshy cap. It often looks like a hamburger bun sticking on the ground. And on their underside of the cap, rather than gills, the thin blade-like gills, they have a series of pores on the underneath. So it looks kind of like a sponge under the cap. Yeah, those are generally very well-tolerated mushrooms, edible-wise. They're one that you can taste and know whether it's edible or not, because there's a lot of really bitter ones. So if you nibble a little bit of the flesh and it's really bitter, then you know that it's toxic. It's okay to do a taste test on a mushroom, but you just want to put a little bitty piece in your mouth, nibble it, and spit it out. It's not enough to hurt you, even if it is a super poisonous one. Sometimes it can lead to good information about whether the mushroom can be eaten or not. But sometimes it tastes really disgusting, so be careful. Yes.
I'm just gonna real quick, sorry to interrupt,
Sorry.
Dan. I'm just gonna real quick introduce, we have Becca, we have Rob. They are microphone runners. And that is because everybody online, which we have over 50 people on there, they can't hear you unless it's through here. So just to include them, we're gonna shove a microphone in your face. And hope you're comfortable with it. So here you
Cool.
go,
Yes.
Ann.
Perfect. Okay. You have a question?
Puffballs, you didn't mention puffballs and they're pretty common.
I almost left the puffballs in this one, but I talked myself out of it because I knew I was going to be short on time, and they're not super common in the river bottoms, although they are obviously. Yes, puffballs, very safe group of edible mushrooms as well. If you know what a puffball is, it's a ball-shaped mushroom that doesn't have a cap or stem or gills or any of those features, just round. If you cut a puffball in half and it's bright white on the inside, then it's an edible puffball. So very easy kind of mushroom to eat. There are a few caveats to that. The amanitas I told you about, they grow from an egg-like structure that is spherical and white usually. They're generally under the surface of the ground, but sometimes they can be exposed by heavy rainfall or high winds blowing leaves around or animals digging them up. And sometimes people can mistake those for a puffball, but if you cut it in half, an amanita egg will show the outline of a cut in half mushroom inside. So think like a button mushroom cut in half, looking at the side that you cut, it'll look like that inside of the egg. So that's why it's important to cut all those puffballs in half. Now, if you find a bunch of puffballs on a log and there's a whole bunch of them in one spot and you cut one in half and it's bright white and you're like, oh, they're still good to eat, there's not going to be an amanita egg in the middle of them kind of thing. So yeah, puffballs are great. A good beginner mushroom, but I took them out of this one to make room. So yeah, good question. All right, anybody else? Oh, good.
My dad told me about peckerheads. Do you know anything about those?
I love that. Okay. All right. That is not who I expected to ask that question, but I love it. So this young gentleman mentioned a funny common name for the half-free morel. So yeah, they kind of do look like that. Yes, they are a good edible mushroom though, related to the morel. So yes, good stuff.
So I've heard when collecting mushrooms to use either a mesh bag or a basket to let the spores spread. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Right. So yes, lots of people say that, right? Okay. So if you want to be kind to the forest, you want to do all you can to spread the mushrooms, even though you're collecting some of them. But honestly, by the time you pick a mushroom, it has already made so many spores, and carrying them around through the woods, you're certainly going to distribute some of them, but I just don't think it would have much of an impact on the overall population of that mushroom. So sometimes things like that are kind of like feel-good things. There's certainly nothing wrong with doing that, and I do use a basket as my preferred collecting container because it's sturdy and it keeps them from getting banged up. But carrying your morels in a mesh bag and expecting it to spread morels, that's a long shot. But great question, and I am asked it very frequently. And honestly, I could be wrong, when it comes down to it. Yeah. Yes? Oh, sorry.
Could you address storage after you've picked them and just dehydrate them, freeze them, what?
Yes, so most mushrooms, if you get a lot and you can't use them all at once, many mushrooms are great to dehydrate. You want to dry them until cracker crisp and then store them in an airtight container like a quart canning jar is a great option. Some mushrooms don't dehydrate very well, but most do pretty good. You can freeze mushrooms. Most of the time you want to cook them a little bit and then freeze them, like chanterelles do a little saute until they're kind of half cooked and then put them in a bag and then put them in the freezer. So that works pretty good. As far as like fresh mushrooms that you just took home, most mushrooms will last about a week in the refrigerator if you store them in a paper sack in the refrigerator. So you've got about a week, but all mushrooms are best when, they've just been picked, basically. Yes.
Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
I noticed that when you showed the Missouri Department of Conservation mushroom book, you said that there were some mistakes. Can any of those mistakes kill us?
Certainly not. No, that's a great question. Nope, there are no mistakes in that book that will kill you. Nope, they're minor mistakes. So you won't notice. Okay.
Yeah.
So we've been on the same property about 19 years, and we have almost never found a morel in the same place twice, which goes against all reported logic. We found one on a septic lagoon rim, just completely random places. Do you have any insights into why our morels are so poorly behaved?
Whew, man, that's a big one. So yeah, now they live with trees, so they will often grow in the same spots when fruiting from those trees that they live with. So wherever you saw a morel, the fungus lives there with the trees in the vicinity, right? Now, the reason you don't find morels there every year is there are a lot of factors that go into the formation of those fruit bodies. And it goes all the way back to the year before you find the morel, because morels make these little tiny kind of knobs called sclerotia, and they'll just hang out under the leaves for a pretty good amount of time. If it gets real cold a little later than expected, where that sclerotia started to form into a tiny little baby morel, oftentimes that frost will zap them and they'll stop. If it's really super dry in a springtime, morels need moisture. That's why they're a spring mushroom. They have to do with those tree species that are in wet areas, bottomland areas. So if it's super dry spring, you won't find as many morels, sometimes none under your favorite trees. And heartbreakingly, that has happened to me lots of times. But don't give up. If you've ever found a morel in a spot, the likelihood of it coming back there when time is right, or when the environmental conditions are good, are very high. So this year, we had a good cold winter. There's a lot of speculation that a cold winter helps for lots of morel fruitings. Seems counterintuitive, but they evolved in temperate climate here, you know, the ones that grow here. So go look at all those spots this year is my recommendation, because we've had a great, everything is lining up pretty good for morels this year. Yes, sir.
Hey, thanks for coming and showing us this.
Thank you for coming.
I have a question about the use of antifungal sprays in agrarian communities. Northern Missouri is mostly farm fields and things like that. Do their spraying techniques affect the fungus in our areas?
Yes, 100%. Yes. Yep. Fungicides are not selective, right? Yeah. So the runoff from large agriculture operations will affect fungi down the line. Absolutely. You don't find a lot of mushrooms in the cornfields or soybean fields or any of those fields. So yes, absolutely. And not just fungicides, but lots of other chemicals too. Yeah. Okay. Who's next?
I want to make a real quick observation that on our farm years ago, we got hit by a crop duster fungicide, and both our mushroom logs and almost none of our woods produced that year. Just to back up what you said, it was rough, but we absolutely saw a pattern. That
Interesting. Interesting, huh? Well, it may have had something to do with it. All right, who's next?
I have two questions about preparation.
Okay.
One, to rinse or not to rinse. And the other one is when you have dried mushrooms, how do you best reconstitute those before cooking them?
Oh, good. Okay, so to rinse or not to rinse depends on the type of mushroom. If you're talking about like a cap and stem gilled mushroom that's a little more fragile and fleshy, I don't recommend rinsing those because they'll just really absorb water. It'll get stuck all in the gills, really hard to get it to evaporate out. If you put wet mushrooms in your refrigerator, they're not going to last very long, right? So I try to keep rinsing limited to the really kind of tough mushrooms like a morel or a chanterelle stands up really good. Lobster mushrooms, a good example, and all the polypores, chicken of the woods, hen of the woods, all that stuff. Yeah, it's okay to rinse those. The idea is that you don't want it to hold a whole bunch of water when you're storing it. As far as dehydrating, a lot of mushrooms, you simply just put the dried mushrooms in a bowl, pour some boiling water over them, let them sit 15 or 20 minutes, and they rehydrate. And then you just use the mushroom as you would otherwise. They're not going to be the same texture as like a fresh mushroom, but some mushrooms are pretty good like that. Morels are awesome dried and rehydrated. All the boletes are excellent dried and rehydrated. It even can intensify and improve their flavors. So usually just pour boiling water over them. If you're going to add them to like a soup or a sauce or something that has a lot of liquid in it, you don't even have to do that. Just toss them in there, let them simmer for a while, and they'll rehydrate. Okay. Shanna.
Hi, Mike. Just curious, what is the best way to stay in touch on your new book release?
Oh, I did not plant her in the crowd, I promise. So yes, I am in the midst of writing a regional field guide for the area. It's called Foraging Mushrooms of the Ozarks, and it is a falcon guide. So if you've ever seen those falcon kind of hiking, fishing guides, it's one of those things. It is not due to be published till about this time next year. So still a little ways to go, but certainly look out for it. The format is meant to be very easy to understand, but also somewhat exhaustive about the mushrooms that I'll be covering. So a lot of the information I talked about tonight and a lot of the answers to a lot of your questions will be in that book. So thanks for asking, Shanna. All right. Any other questions?
I have a question. Yeah, I have a question.
ready.
So I lived out west for a little bit, and their morels are like this totally different phenomenon. Like people pick them in the summer, and it's like after fires is the big deal. And it seems like we're getting more fires here. And I was just kind of curious if you'd had any experience in like reactions of morel populations after a burn.
Right, good question. So burn morels are an interesting phenomena. It is not a common phenomena here in Missouri. So you can't go to a forest fire, you know, after the year after a forest fire here in Missouri and find a bunch of morels growing in the burn. It's not impossible that that will happen. And there is some pretty cool new research where they are finding some of those burn morel species in our region, but not finding fruit bodies. So they're finding the mycelium in soil doing DNA sequencing. So pretty interesting stuff. Now on the West Coast and in the Rocky Mountains, then yes, burn morels are amazing. So there are species of black morels that show up, say there's a real hot forest fire in the fall in a mountainous area or you know, a national park or something, and it burns a whole bunch of thousands of acres. We hear about it every year, right? Well, the spring following those burns in certain areas will produce large amounts of morels. There's actually entire cultures built around this phenomena where they put camps in the woods for a couple of months in the mountains, and there are people out picking morels all day long, finding giant amounts. And they have these booths set up. It's kind of the middleman. You go sell your big pile of morels that day, and then they get distributed to the market. So burn morels are incredible. I have not personally done that because I am here in the Ozarks. You know, this is where I've actually never seen a burn morel, but I have lots of friends in the mushroom world who post pictures about them and stuff, and I'm pretty jealous because the burn morels are nuts. They show up in areas where there aren't usually that species of morel. You might find a few little yellow morels sporadically, but after those burns, the entire forest floor that's all charred still can be blanketed with these things. So pretty incredible, but sadly not as common here in Missouri, but not impossible.
I have a question to piggyback off of that kind of.
Yes.
It's similar. I was wondering about like controlled burns and how that affects the mushrooms and like,
Man, you guys are asking such good questions. So this is a topic that I talk about a lot, and there isn't very much information about it, but just from being someone who has learned a lot about the way fungi work and how they work in ecosystems, I feel like burning an entire forest is not good for fungi. You're certainly going to reduce populations of fungi that decay dead wood. A lot of the wood gets burnt up, especially small diameter wood and other things like leaves. There are lots of species of mushrooms that live in the leaves, and they rely on that kind of duff, either pine needle duff or leaf layer to continue their life cycle. So burning a forest almost surely reduces diversity, if nothing else. So yeah, I don't burn the woods at my place. And if you're trying to encourage fungi to thrive, then I don't think it's good practice. Yes.
A very quick observation, then a question. Another great way to use dried mushrooms, I grind them up in a mortar and pestle, use them to season venison sausage. That mushroom powder is a really strong, basically flavoring powder. But the question is, have you experimented with fermentation at all of mushrooms, edible fermentation?
Oh, fermentation. Not very much. So I have fermented a lot of different things, and I've been making sauerkraut for 20 years or whatever, and made kimchi quite a few times, and then fermented wild greens and things. But sadly, when I've tried to ferment mushrooms, it doesn't really turn out very well. I made some and I shared them with a friend. I think they were shiitake that I had grown, and she said they tasted like poop mushrooms. So yeah, so I gave up after that. And then I was like, she's kind of right. So.
Well, I think poop mushrooms is a great note to end on. Mike did say he'll hang around for questions to show you.
Yes, anyone who'd like to stick around, come on up and check out the mushrooms on the table. I have little tags that show their identities, and there's a QR code on those tags. If you put your camera on that, it'll take you to a website that'll tell you about the mushroom, and there's some little microscopes you can look at, and I'll show you guys that stuff. Thanks everybody so much for coming.